France's eastern border with Germany was protected by the impregnable Maginot Line, the last word in modern defence. This consisted of a linear fortress of concrete bunkers and tunnels with modern gun emplacements stretching from Belgium to Switzerland. But the French army was not entirely modernised. One of the essential modes of communication on this front remained the carrier pigeon, and the French army reserves consisted of not a few men of the calibre of Private Sartre. Apart from the distraction of sending up a couple of weather balloons each day, Sartre was utterly committed to his work. Unfortunately, this had nothing to do with the army's work. Sartre was well into the first draft of his next novel, and was busy studying Heidegger with a view to completing a really big book on philosophy. The sight of a private reading a book of impenetrable German metaphysics, which even to Germans reads like a code, doesn't seem to have bothered Sartre's patriotic colleagues, or even come to the notice of his officers. Sartre's existentialist ideas were developing fast. In light of our contingency, and thus the absurdity of our existence, we must take complete responsibility for our lives, he explained in his almost daily, pages-long letters to the Beaver. We have no right to bemoan our fate. Each individual wills his own destiny. He wills his character, and even the circumstances under which this character acts. Taken to its logical conclusion, this has some peculiar implications, but Sartre was never one to shirk such difficulties. Yes, this did mean that he, as an individual, was responsible for everything, he explained to the Beaver, which meant he was even responsible for World War II, and he must be willing to accept this responsibility and act accordingly. As he later put it, "This is my war. It is in my image, and I deserve it. Everything happens as if I carried the entire responsibility for this war, so I am this war." This seemingly ludicrous position is in fact far more defensible than many seemingly more plausible philosophical positions. One has only to think of nihilism, or Wittgenstein's claim that all philosophy was just a misunderstanding due to linguistic errors. As we have seen, Sartre's existentialism has its roots in both Hume's empiricism and Descartes' rationalism. Taken to their extremes, both of these veer toward lonely solipsism. Hume, we do not actually experience the individual existence of others. Descartes, if everything except I think, therefore I am, is uncertain, then the existence of others must also fall into this category. Sartre merely grasps the bull by the horns. He shows the implications of both Descartes and Hume. It may go against all common sense, like most philosophy and much of modern science, but if we are true to our own consciousness, and fillet out all accepted prejudices and assumptions, Sartre's is a defensible position. It is also a brave one, filled with an almost Nietzschean fortitude and optimism. This is my lot. I will make the best of it. If I am free to change my life, I must be responsible for my life. We may draw the line at the multiple sclerosis sufferer, or the snatched hostage forced to live chained in a dungeon, but something akin to Sartre's existential attitude informs both Stephen Hawking and several of those who survived as Beirut hostages. Such people accept what is determined in their fate, and yet overcome this with their remaining freedom. They do, in one sense, take responsibility for their entire life. Traditional philosophers object to Sartre's position by insisting that philosophy should describe what is, not what ought to be, no matter how morally laudable this may be. But existentialism insists upon plunging philosophy into action, so it's not surprising that it should at least partly appear to be a strategy for living. Admittedly, this comes close to being morally coercive, but at this stage Sartre's idea of good was sufficiently open-ended to exclude his existentialism from the charge of being merely a system of morality in disguise. Only later, as his existentialism became more socially involved, would this change. Meanwhile, unaware that he was merely a pawn in the existential condition of a meteorological private in the French army, Hitler overran Belgium, outflanked the Maginot Line, and invaded France. They have overstretched their resources and will be unable to defend such a large front, Sartre reassured de Beauvoir. But he must have changed his mind, for within a month carrier pigeon traffic on the entire Eastern Front came to a halt, as Private Sartre willed his and the French army's surrender. Sartre was now able to travel to Germany to study Heidegger in his native land, in a prisoner of war camp. Their conditions were no laughing matter. Even so, Sartre continued with his reading program as indefatigably as if he were still at the front line defending his native land. Heidegger held the key. It was he who had taken existentialism the next step beyond Husserl's phenomenology. Heidegger's main work was Sein und Zeit, Being and Time, published in 1927. In this he denies traditional viewpoints such as those of Descartes and Hume. As an individual, I am not, and can never be, a detached observer of the world, one whose utmost certainty is that he thinks, Descartes, or that he has experiences, Hume. No, primarily I am aware of myself as an existent being in the midst of a world. For Heidegger, my utmost certainty is my Dasein, literally being there, more helpfully translated as my being in the world. Heidegger's concept of being is contrasted with knowing, through thought or experience, and the abstract concepts that arise from this knowing. Such concepts do not capture the individuality and specificity of my being in the world. This latter, and attaining a deeper awareness of it, is the business of philosophy. Heidegger's main preoccupation is with the question of being. In pursuit of this, he even rejects Husserl's notion of phenomenology. Acts of consciousness, free from all presuppositions, such as achieved by phenomenology, cannot be the fundamental source of our knowledge. Being in the world remains our primary awareness, and only from this can we begin to approach the question of the meaning of being. My fundamental sense of my own being is of course beset by the host of trivialities involved in my being in the world, the distractions of everyday existence. But it is still possible to approach an understanding of the significance of being. How? Only in the anticipation of death is all accidental and provisional possibility driven out. When one has grasped the finitude of one's existence, it pulls one away from the unending multiplicity of possibilities which immediately present themselves, possibilities such as comfortableness, shirking, and taking things lightly. To achieve this absolute resoluteness, we must be free for death. This is all very admirable, if a little Germanic. But why should we not seek out comfort, diversions, and relax a bit? Because this is not the way to understand the meaning of being, according to Heidegger. But why is such activity necessary? Or alternatively, does such activity, or even the words that describe it, have any meaning at all? This, like many other concepts Heidegger uses, remains woolly and devoid of exact definition. Indeed, the jargon he generates in trying to describe these woolly concepts often degenerates into the very word mysticism he deplores. 2 examples will suffice. Temporality gets experienced in a phenomenally primordial way in Dasein's authentic being a whole, in phenomenon of anticipatory resoluteness. Or, the wherein of an act of understanding which assigns or refers itself is that for which one lets entities be encountered in the kind of being that belongs to involvements, and this wherein is the phenomenon of the world. And this is far from Heidegger at his worst. But back to Heidegger's more intelligible arguments. For many people in early 20th century Germany, Heidegger's life would have appeared to be the epitome of comfortableness, shirking, and taking things lightly. He lived the life of a university professor, complete with a well-appointed lodge in the Black Forest. His highly ambivalent attitude toward the Nazis reeked of shirking, to say the very least, and he certainly took the Nazi period lightly enough not to issue any later apology for it. But the strengths and weaknesses of Heidegger's philosophy should not be identified with the strengths and weaknesses of the man himself. At any rate, Sartre didn't, and this is what concerns us here. Yet even taken at face value, Heidegger's arguments are not always what they seem. Underlying his earnest exhortation to shun creature comforts, face up to things, and take life seriously, are hidden assumptions which are at extreme variance with certain contemporary attitudes. For instance, In the aftermath of Nietzsche's epoch-making pronouncement, "God is dead," many now believe that life itself has no overall purpose. There is no such thing as good or evil, and thus life has no transcendent value or meaning, in which case it is futile and can even be regarded as an absurd joke. Millions die of famine in Africa through no fault of their own. A jovial nonentity of limited talent and ambition becomes the most powerful man on earth. So what right do we have to claim for our own existence the privilege of utmost seriousness? Likewise, we spend much of our time shirking, relaxing from the hardness and suffering of existence, or facing up to ultimate questions about it. This shirking is often called enjoying yourself, which leads to happiness, the goal of right-minded philosophies from Aristotle to the present day. This enjoyment of life, or shirking, can range from reading high literature to knitting woolly socks, Heidegger's favourite hobby, and as to comfortableness, without it there would be no civilization or thought of any kind. Culture, from mathematical reasoning to operatic sentimentality or poignant penny flute playing, requires comfortable leisure for its creation. Caught without woolly socks, having lost the key to my mountain lodge on a snowy night in the Black Forest, my thoughts do indeed turn to the question of being, but in a rather more practical sense than Heidegger had in mind. This is no ridiculous example. By Heidegger's criteria, my frigid thoughts in the snowbound woods would have been shirking the issue. Heidegger's philosophy is just as rooted in the primacy of thought as that of Descartes. Sartre understood this and saw it as his task to divert Heidegger's profound analysis of being from thought into action. He sought to return it to Kierkegaard's original existentialism, where philosophy was concerned with subjective life, the choices and acts of the individual. But first, instead of philosophy involved in action, it was necessary for the philosopher himself to become involved in some action. Sartre was determined to get out of his prisoner of war camp, which he finally managed in March 1941. According to the legend, he escaped. In fact, he managed to obtain a forged medical certificate, which ensured his release and return to Paris on compassionate grounds. Had he escaped, it is unlikely the Germans would have issued him a free rail pass to Paris. And he would have been on the run with no identity documents, whereas in fact he lived quite openly, resumed his old teaching job in the suburbs, and found a room just around the corner from Beaver. Amidst the bleak discomfort of Nazi-occupied Paris, Sartre sat down to write his philosophical masterpiece, L'être et le néant, Being and Nothingness. This was to be no ordinary achievement. For a start, the final draft of Sartre's work occupied more than 700 pages. This required more paper than was easy to come by in a city beset by wartime shortages, where it was difficult to come by enough bread, consisting of chaff and sawdust, although the café where Sartre wrote still served coffee, made with ground roasted acorns. As is evident from its title, Sartre's work was heavily influenced by Heidegger, and not just its ideas. There are long passages in which Sartre allows his normally pellucid prose to become bogged down in a morass of jargon. Being a truly creative writer, Sartre refused to take on Heidegger's jargon wholesale and set about inventing his own impenetrable terminology. Fortunately, the main message of Sartre's philosophy is radiantly clear and can be conveyed with a minimum of existentialist gobbledygook. This was to be no ordinary book of philosophy, as he explained to de Beauvoir. There will be a few boring passages, but there will also be a few spicy ones. One concerns all holes in general, and the other focuses on the anus and love Italian style. To avoid disappointment, I had better reveal that we will be concentrating on the philosophical rather than the speleological aspects of this work. First, an explanation of the title, L'être et le néant. This delineates between human consciousness, or nothingness, néant, and being, or thingness, être. As Sartre explained, consciousness is total emptiness, since the entire world is outside it. Thus consciousness is outside the realm of matter, i.e., it is not matter in the jargon, and for this reason it remains beyond the realms of mechanistic determinism. It is free. Here, Sartre's notion of being deviates from that of Heidegger. For Sartre, being is the conscious being of the individual who has the power to organize his awareness of the world. Husserl's phenomenology had returned consciousness to the vivid and intense awareness of artists and biblical prophets. Once again, consciousness became awful, threatening, hazardous, with havens of grace and love. But Sartre